Welcome and thank you for attending the Black History Matters series presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. My name is Victoria Basulto, and I am a current senior at Colgate University located in Hamilton, New York, as well as an intern for the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I will be facilitating the presentation of 28 videos that will be released throughout the month of February 2021 and that you can view on our YouTube channel or on our website. I will now lead you through some introductory statements. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum is located in Peterborough, New York, in the building that you can see on the screen where the inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society was held in 1835. NAHOF's mission is as follows. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. NAHOF has worked in coordination with the Garrett Smith Estate National Historic Landmark, which is also located in Peterborough, New York, to create the Black History Matters series. The following statement is the purpose of Black History Matters. You can read along on your screen. NAHOF supports racial justice movements seeking to address racial inequality, given their resonance with NAHOF's mission to address the second and ongoing abolition to end racism. NAHOF believes a significant number of Americans do not understand the current racial justice protests due to their unfamiliarity with 4 centuries of Black American history because this history was either excluded or taught inadequately in schools. NAHOF knows that education is a powerful step towards ending racism, and that understanding the history of the enslavement and dehumanization of Black Americans provides critical context for the ongoing racial justice movements and the persistence of racism in America. Given NAHOF's commitment to strengthening knowledge of history as one route to confront racism, NAHOF will present Black History Matters, a series of crash courses covering some examples of neglected topics in Black American history throughout the month of February 2021. I'd like to now introduce our speaker for today, Erin Burke. Erin holds a Bachelor's of Arts in History and a Master's of Science in Museum Education from Colgate University and the University of Glasgow. She's now based in Glasgow, where she works at the Scottish Civic Trust as her Communications and Events Officer. She has a focus on inclusive communications and a passion for making Scotland's heritage more representative of and accessible to all. She is also responsible for the Civic Trust's recently released anti-racism policy. In addition to her work at the Scottish Civic Trust, Erin works alongside peers in 20+ heritage organizations to run a national campaign to increase the number and diversity of heritage volunteers in Scotland. I'd like to invite Erin to begin her presentation on anti-racism education.
Hello and welcome to today's Black History Matters video, which will discuss anti-racism. I'd first like to emphasize that this talk would not have been possible without the many Black educators, authors, activists, and thinkers who have created so many resources and from whom I have learned so much. A full list of sources for this talk and suggestions for further reading can be found below the video in the description, and I encourage everyone to continue their anti-racist education by checking out those resources to learn more. Okay. For today's talk on anti-racism, I will be covering what is racism, why does racism exist, what is anti-racism, how can I talk to people about racism, what other steps can I take to combat racism, and then a final word on solidarity. So what is racism? In order to dismantle racism, we must first define what racism is. A racist idea is one that posits people of color as inferior to white people, either biologically, culturally, or in any other aspect. Racist ideas justify the unfair treatment and oppression of people of color, including enslavement, segregation, incarceration, murder, and the other violences covered throughout the videos of the Black History Matters program. Racism takes several different forms, and these different forms of racism work in tandem or with each other to reinforce racist ideas, behavior, and policy. The types of racism are, firstly, individual racism. This refers to the attitudes, beliefs, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism in conscious or unconscious ways. Examples of individual racism include telling a racist joke, believing in the inherent superiority of white people over other racial groups, or not hiring a person of color because something doesn't feel right. Oftentimes, individual racism is the focus of discussions about racism in the United States. And while dismantling or addressing individual racism is key to ending racism, a sole focus on individual racism fails to connect personal ideologies, so personal ideas or beliefs, to larger societal ones. Again, the different types of racism work to reinforce each other and must all be addressed in tandem. Then there's interpersonal racism. This occurs between individuals. Examples of interpersonal racism include public expressions of white superiority or the inferiority of people of color, often involving slurs, biases, or hateful words or actions. There is also institutional racism. This occurs in an organization. Institutional racism includes discriminatory treatments, unfair policies, or biased practices based on race that result in inequitable outcomes for white people over people of color. These institutional policies often never mention any racial group, but the effect is still to create disadvantages. An example of institutional racism is the American school system, in which students of color are more frequently distributed into the most crowded classrooms and the most underfunded schools. These underfunded schools have fewer resources, often less experienced teachers, and also higher dropout rates. Students of color at these underfunded schools are also less likely to have access to college preparatory schools and are more likely to be subjected to harsh disciplinary policies. Finally, there is structural racism, which is the overarching system of racial bias across institutions and society at large. These systems give privileges to white people and disadvantage people of color. This encompasses the entire system of white supremacy, diffused and infused in all aspects of society, including laws, history, culture, politics, economic, and the entire social fabric. This is the most profound and pervasive form of racism, and all other forms of racism, so individual, interpersonal, internalized, emerge from structural racism. So why does racism exist? It is a common misconception that racism emerged out of white people's hate and ignorance, which led the masses to then elect racist policymakers to enact racist ideas and establish laws, processes, and rules that entrenched racial inequity. However, Ibram Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, has instead persuasively shown that in fact the opposite is the case. Rich white Europeans invented racism out of colonial self-interest because it furthered their political, economic, and cultural interests. And then they constructed racist ideas to justify these policies. So what do we mean when we say rich white Europeans invented racism? The concept of race did not actually exist until the 15th century when Portugal began trading enslaved Africans. In order to justify the kidnapping, dehumanization, and enslavement of Black Africans, white Europeans constructed the idea that there was something fundamentally different or inferior about Black people. These racist ideas constructed Black people as inherently savage and lazy and therefore in need of saving and discipline by white overlords. These racist ideas were then consumed by the wider population, sparking race-based conflict and leading to the continued power of white elites. So essentially by stoking race-based conflict, white elites were able to both continue enslaving Black Africans, which furthered their economic interests by ensuring that there was a readily available source of cheap labor, and also were able to direct the anger and attention of poor white people at enslaved Black people rather than at the white elite. This divided the lowest class of America along racial lines, thereby preventing a mass uprising along class lines. And so this again entrenches the power of the white elite. However, it is important to note that racist ideas, while enabling the continued economic oppression of poor white people by preventing class solidarity, still grant poor white people privilege, namely in putting them above people of color. Thus, racism is not born out of ignorance. Racism, history shows, is born out of its profitability and continues to most significantly benefit and entrench the white elite. So what is anti-racism? The concept of anti-racism has its roots in abolition and advocates not just for the end of slavery, but also for structural changes in a post-emancipation society, like the eradication of prisons and the abolition of the police. More recently, Ibram Kendi and other scholars and activists have used the term anti-racist specifically to make the point that it's not sufficient to merely be not racist. So what exactly is the difference between being anti-racist and being not racist? Being anti-racist means fighting actively and persistently against racism. This is different from not being racist, which often implies a neutrality or a lack of action either against racism or on its behalf. However, because we all live in a racist society, as we've talked through in the first few slides, neutrality is not possible. Action or policy is either racist in that it continues and contributes to a history that regards and treats different races as inherently unequal, or is anti-racist in that it is trying to dismantle that history. Essentially, a lack of persistent action against racism enables racism to continue. Anti-racist ideas recognize that the inequality of Black and white people in American society is solely a function of racial discrimination rather than any type of inherent inequality or inferiority. And that race is an artificial construct invented to oppress people of color. So by a construct, we mean, as we've talked about, it's a concept invented by rich white Europeans to further their own interests. However, this construct or concept of race is so deeply embedded in our society today that it has very real effects. Anti-racist ideas also recognize all races as equal with neither inherently good nor bad qualities, and know that all humans are 99.99% genetically similar. So before we move on, I'd just like to further reiterate that anti-racism is about acting and doing rather than being. As Senator Cory Booker has persuasively said, we can't let these conversations devolve into the impotent simplicity of who is or who isn't a racist. If the answer to the question, do racism and white supremacy exist, is yes, then the real question isn't who is or isn't a racist, but who is and isn't doing something about it, end quote. So what does this mean? It means that no one is born racist or anti-racist. Racist and anti-racist actions are choices that we can make. Doing anti-racist work entails a conscious decision to make frequent and equitable choices and requires ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection. As I explained earlier, in the absence of making anti-racist choices, one upholds these unequal institutions that oppress people of color. So how can I talk to people about racism? Firstly, it is important to note that anti-racism work is different for white people and for people of color. For people of color, anti-racism work includes recognizing how race and racism have been internalized and whether this has been applied to other people of color. For white people, anti-racism work includes racial identity development in which white people acknowledge their privilege, work to change internalized racism, and interrupt racism when they see it. However, there is a common misconception that white people should ask people of color to explain racism to them when they're trying to learn about racism. While it is important to center the voices of non-white people in research and anti-racist education by following people of color on social media and reading books, listening to podcasts, and watching videos by people of color, it is equally important to remove the burden of education from them. Having to explain racism can take a huge toll on people of color who already bear the exhausting burden of racial oppression. White people need to take on the work of educating themselves and other white people about racism and anti-racism. And there are many anti-racism resources already available, including those linked below this video. As such, the remaining sections of this video about talking to others about racism and taking other anti-racist actions are geared towards white people. So when speaking to other white people about racism, it is important to first understand the historical context of oppression and racism in America and how that context creates today's racial inequalities and injustices. I've covered a very brief explanation of what racism is and why it exists earlier in the talk, but again, more sources can be found below. In particular, Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning is a definitive history of racist ideas in America. Also, just to keep in mind, when you're having conversations about race, you don't need to know all the answers or think that you have to do it alone. It can be helpful to bring resources or read an article or watch a video to reflect on together with your conversation partner. So if you're in a conversation about race and you encounter interpersonal racism, there are a few ways to respond and to interrupt it. Asking questions is a powerful tool to seek clarity or to offer a new perspective. The National Museum of African American History and Culture has compiled the following helpful tips. So you could seek clarity. This looks like saying something, tell me more about X. So tell me more about why you think that or what you mean by that. You could also offer an alternative perspective. So this could look like, have you ever considered that Black crime rates are tied to poverty and not inherent criminality? Another version of offering an alternative perspective is speaking your truth. So you could phrase it as, I don't see it that way. I see it as whatever other way. And then finally, you could try to find common ground. This could look like, so we don't agree on looting during protests, but we can agree that racial inequity is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. When having conversations about race, you should try to push through discomfort and disagreement, but you should consider pausing and returning to the conversation if it has moved towards conflict and away from conversation and learning, or you feel unsafe or unheard. So if you feel these things happening, you could say something like, could we revisit this conversation tomorrow or at some other time? Or if necessary, you could set a boundary. So please do not say that again to me or around me. So to further aid you in having conversations about race and racism, I've compiled rebuttals to racist talking points, which will help you debunk common misconceptions about race and police brutality, and help you keep conversations about racism focused on the fight for racial justice and equality. Much of these rebuttals are inspired by @Sujoy Shah on Twitter, who produced a thread of quick rebuttals for racist talking points back in June of 2020, and I've linked this below. So the first statement, cops kill more white people than Black people. There are more white people in America, so yes, in total, cops do kill more white people than Black people. However, the important thing is that Black people are killed at a much higher rate than white people. In 2020, Black people were 28% of those killed by police, despite being only 13% of the population. Also, 1 in every 1,000 Black men and boys can expect to be killed by police, and people of color are more likely to be stopped, searched, given citations, and arrested when exhibiting similar behavior to white people. Next, the statement or question, what about Black on Black crime? This is a common talking point that people will bring up in order to deflect from conversations about racism and police brutality. The phrase Black on Black crime actually obscures the economic and social inequalities which are established by racist policies that contribute to high crime rates in Black neighborhoods. So let's talk about why this is distracting and misleading. Firstly, Black people aren't uniquely predisposed to commit crimes against each other. Crime is generally just racially segregated based on a number of factors, including that most people commit crimes against people that they either know or live near. According to the FBI's 2014 Uniform Crime Reports, close to 90% of African-American homicides were committed by other African-Americans, and similarly, 82% of white American homicide victims were killed by other white people. Another factor that contributes to crime is poverty. A 2014 special report by the Department of Justice found that Black and white households that lived in poverty were much more likely to be victims of crime than wealthy households, and also that they were victims of crime at similar rates. Black households in poverty were victims of crime at a rate of 51.3 per 1,000. And this is compared to white households in poverty, which were victims of crime at a similar rate of 56.4 per 1,000. Black people are more likely to live in poverty than white people, and this is due to racist policies. So white people or white families have 6 times as much wealth as Black families on average. And pre-COVID, the poverty rate for Black people sat at about 27.2%, and this is almost 3 times that of their white counterparts at 9.6%. Additionally, unemployment is far higher for Black people. At the end of 2015, the Black unemployment rate was 9.5%, and the white unemployment rate was 4.5%. So in sum, poor people in America, which due to racist policies are disproportionately Black, commit crimes in response to economic security. Black people are not naturally predisposed to being criminals. Okay, the statement, white privilege isn't real, or white people have been oppressed too. Firstly, to define white privilege is an institutional rather than personal set of benefits granted to people who, by race, resemble the people who dominate powerful positions in institutions. So this is white people. This means that purely on the basis of skin color, doors are open to white people that are not open to people of color. Having white privilege does not mean that white people's lives are necessarily easy or without difficulties or oppression, and white people can absolutely experience oppression on the basis of gender, sexuality, ableism, class, etc. But it does mean that white people's lives will not be adversely affected because of their race specifically. Evidence of white privilege includes the wealth gap. So those will be the same numbers about wealth and unemployment inequities that we covered on the last slide. Also, according to multiple studies, those with white names are twice as likely to get an interview than African-American sounding names, even when the CV is completely identical. So that's an example of certain doors opening solely based on being white. And again, white people are not killed at disproportionately higher rates by police and are not as likely to be arrested when exhibiting similar or even more violent behavior than black people. The recent Black Lives Matter movements and then also the insurrection at the Capitol in January are poignant case studies here. Black Lives Matter protesters, many of whom were people of color, who were peacefully gathering to fight for greater racial justice and were unarmed, were met with a massive police presence that erupted into violence and resulted in many arrests. 6 months later, white and armed domestic terrorists who violently stormed the nation's capital to overturn a legal election were practically invited in, and in the meantime, there's not been a lot of accountability. Moving to the next statement. So this is all sad, or racial inequity is obviously awful, but I can't support rioting and looting. The vast majority of protests are peaceful, and those that turn violent are typically because of cops shooting tear gas and non-lethal bullets, thereby beginning a cycle of violence. Some people may take advantage of the chaos of a riot to loot stores, but this distracts from the goals of the protests and is not what the movement is about, nor what should be the focus of conversation, which is racial inequity in America. Although it is not contradictory to believe, it is not contradictory to believe small businesses shouldn't be destroyed. And also there is a problem with racism and police brutality that needs to be addressed. They are not mutually exclusive concepts. However, it is harmful to focus on the property loss during some riots at the expense of the point of the protest, which is to end racial injustice and the disproportionate killing of Black people by police. In the rare instances when violence is started by protesters, it is important to contextualize this violence. Disruptive behavior like looting, vandalism, and violence are the byproduct of years and years of injustice and inaction. So what's happening is an expression of frustration and a reaction to trauma built up over lifetimes of injustice. And it's only being compounded by law enforcement's increased use of force against those protesting it. For the next statement, why can't people just peacefully protest? Again, the vast majority of protesters are peaceful, but ultimately history has shown that detractors will find fault in all forms of resistance. So there's no right way to protest. After all, Colin Kaepernick received harsh backlash for silently kneeling in protest of police brutality, and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated for leading a peaceful movement against racial inequity. If criticism and scrutiny are to be expected regardless of the method, then it's understandable that some protesters feel like disruptive acts are the best way to call attention to the issues. So the statement, not all cops kill or brutalize people, or it's just a few bad apples. In a similar way that failing to take anti-racist action enables the continuation of racism, not killing or not brutalizing people as a cop doesn't change a system that disproportionately harms people of color. Moreover, the system protects those cops that do kill or brutalize people. 98.3% of killings by police from 2013 to 2020 have not resulted in officers being charged with a crime. Thus, even good cops are complicit in a system that enables police brutality, and cops who speak out against racism are often punished for it. Lastly, the statement, "but I don't see color." People who say this often mean well, but they are invalidating the experiences of people of color. You can't discuss and change problems if you refuse to acknowledge that they exist in the first place. We must listen to each other's experiences and value the things that make us different, and understand how those differences are used to perpetuate or continue oppression. You need to see color, listen to people's different stories, and honor them by working against racism. So beyond speaking with other white people about race, what steps can be taken to combat racism? Anti-racism starts with the small choices that you make, like who you build relationships with, what media you consume and follow, and where you shop. Firstly, you can amplify Black voices by following and sharing Black educators, activists, authors, and thinkers' content. Secondly, you can support Black-owned businesses, and I've included a directory of Black-owned businesses in the description below this video. Thirdly, you can set up a recurring donation to a Black-led organization, such as the Communities Against Police Brutality, Campaign Zero, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the LGBTQ Defense Fund, the Bail Project, and the National Bail Fund Networks. And I've included all of their links below. And fourthly, you can take political action by signing petitions, contacting your representatives, and voting. Black Lives Matter, the NAACP, the Audre Lorde Project, and Show Racism the Red Card are good places to start when looking for petitions and actions to take. They are all linked below this video, along with websites and guides that will help you locate your local representatives so that you can contact them about racial injustice. Voting also enables you to impact the decisions and policies that our government makes, and I've included a quick link below so you can check if you're registered to vote and if you're not, to register to vote. So to close, I'll just touch on a final word on solidarity and working together. Racism is extremely pervasive in today's society, but it is not inevitable. As history has shown, race is an invented idea, albeit with real consequences, and thus can be deconstructed and eradicated. The continued efforts of each of us individually can add up to a lasting change in our society. Since racism operates at multiple levels, we have to make anti-racist choices at the various levels. So this is individual, interpersonal, and institutional, to eradicate racism from the structures and fabrics of our society. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi writes, "We must believe in the possibility that we can strive to be anti-racist from this day forward. We must believe in the possibility that we can transform our societies to be anti-racist from this day forward. Racist power is not godly. Racist policies are not indestructible. Racial inequities are not inevitable. Racist ideas are not natural to the human mind. We must keep fighting for and dreaming of a world where justice, opportunity, and resources are available to everyone."
I'd like to thank Erin for that educational presentation. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, Erin has provided a reference list of sources with websites that you can explore to learn more. This reference list will be linked beneath the video in the video description. I will also invite you to fill out a quick survey linked beneath that same video description, which will help us gather feedback about this specific topic. The survey will take you no more than 5 minutes to fill out and will provide us with valuable information that will help us in the formation of future presentations like this one. Should you have any questions regarding the presentation itself, Erin has made her email available so that you may contact her with any questions that you may have. Additionally, please do contact NAHOF with any questions or if you're interested in learning more about the organization and its work. NAHOF's contact information is available on the screen. Once again, I'd like to thank Erin for providing a program for Black History Matters. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us on this educational journey. Please remember, we will be releasing a new presentation each day of this February 2021, and we hope we'll see you at our next presentation. Thank you.